So if I were betting money, I would say the dynamic in a Trump administration would be you have more concentrated and prepared MAGA, anti-deep state, Heritage Foundation, America First Institute ideologues, and you have more better prepared traditional internationalists and Republicans.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement and Impact at the United States Study Centre. Thanks for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. In November, Americans will head to the polls to cast their vote for who will hold the most powerful office in the world, Joe Biden or Donald Trump. But it isn't only Americans who are impacted. What would a Trump administration versus a Biden administration 2.0 mean for allies and partners around the world? What will stay the same regardless of who wins? And importantly, what can countries do now to prepare for the next 4 years? This week, the USSC released its election year Red Book, Blue Book, a guide to the next U.S. administration report to answer these questions and more across everything from AUKUS to climate change. And between now and the election, here on the podcast, we're going to be bringing you episodes that take a look at different chapters in the report and give you the Red Book, Blue Book breakdown on that topic. So to kick things off, we're welcoming USSC CEO Dr. Michael Green back on the podcast to talk about his chapter, what the 2024 election means for America's Asian alliances. So thanks so much for joining us again today, Mike. And of course, we'll get you by the numbers stat at the end. I think last time you were on the podcast, it was with John Kunkel, and he turned tables on us and gave us a quiz. I'm hoping it'll be a little bit easier this time.
I was told there'd be no math, but okay.
So just to start off, in your piece, you acknowledge that, quote, Trump was the most deliberately divisive president in U.S. history, end quote. But you still go on to say that a lot would stay the same regarding Asian alliances, regardless of who wins. Why is that? Why do you make that case?
Well, when you look at a country or a society or history as a social scientist, there are always two big variables you're trying to figure out. One is agency. And the other is structure. And in American politics and in this election year, when you talk about agency, you're talking about Donald Trump and Joe Biden, their individual impact on history, on policy, on politics, on U.S. Life and the world. And it's really hard to stop paying attention. It's just overwhelmingly, use your adjective, interesting, fascinating, horrifying, inspiring. But the reality is that history unfolds based on the interplay of agency and structure is usually much more important. And structure, in the context of American politics and America's role in the world, includes things like the way the U.S. Constitution works. It's not a Westminster unitary parliamentary system. It's a system of checks and balance, a presidential system. So the Congress has considerable independent action. And when Donald Trump was president the first time, he made a lot of noise about pulling troops out of Korea and NATO, for example. And the Congress, led by Republicans from his own party, introduced amendments in legislation saying the president cannot use any of the funds we appropriate to pull troops out of Korea or NATO. And so this game of, rock, paper, scissors, checks and balance is different from, in many ways, from a Westminster system, but it's pretty important in terms of the structure of how American law and government works. Structure also matters in terms of the interests of the American people. Donald Trump makes a lot of noise about being Mr. Tariff Man and threatening massive tariffs. But in public opinion surveys that we've done at the center, that I did back at CSIS in Washington, you never get even 20% of the American public saying they agree with complete economic decoupling from China. And you have interest groups in the US that are enormously dependent on trade: farmers, ranchers, businesses. So the structure of interests and interest groups and power within the US system also is a check on sudden changes due to agency, due to one person's different and disruptive vision. And then there's the structure of international politics. The U.S. Is locked in an epic geopolitical competition with China and Russia. It's not a bipolar competition. Japan's in there with us, NATO and Australia and Korea and others. But U.S. interests and the structure of international politics are pushing the U.S. Closer to allies, not further away. And in our polls, 60% of Americans say our alliances in Asia are really good for us. Opposition to U.S. alliances in Asia is very low. So these are all structural factors. Some are legal and constitutional. Some are interests in international politics. Some are domestic interest groups that are very sticky. They're very inelastic. And that's why last time when Donald Trump was president, some U.S. alliances, Japan, Australia, actually didn't do so badly. I like to quote the Mark Twain line when Mark Twain was asked, "What did you think about the music of Richard Wagner?" He said, "It wasn't as bad as it sounds." There was it's not pretty bad, but if you actually do an assessment, Australia, Japan, Korea, a lot of U.S. allies came out of it with some very specific strengthening of how we work together. That wasn't true for all allies. I think Europe had and France and Germany had a very hard time. U.S.-Canada relations were pretty rough. But the structure matters. And our Red Book, Blue Book has, as the editor, Jared Monshine, likes to say, a big purple section. A lot of what's going to happen over the next 4 or 5 years does not depend all that much on who's president because of the structural factors behind American politics and international relations. There's going to be more continuity than change. In all likelihood, Yogi Berra, the baseball great, liked to say, prediction's difficult, especially about the future. We're not making a prediction with this book. We're looking at the most likely scenarios. And I think very importantly saying, don't forget about structure.
Yeah. And one, key element of that structure are also the people in that structure, the key players in the administration. And that's one thing that certainly Trump has been signaling would be a big change in his next administration. He said, if so-called rhinos, Republicans in name only, will not be part of his administration. So assuming that he, follows through on that, how would you be confident that a more MAGA-forward administration won't make substantive changes on issues related to relationships in Asia? It also reminds me of that the famous/infamous op-ed, the anonymous op-ed that now we know as Miles Taylor, who was the chief of staff of the Department of Homeland Security, who said that people shouldn't worry about, this is when Trump was in power, they shouldn't worry because, quote, there were, quote, adults in the room, end quote. Yeah. So would that still be the case, or is that different?
Well, I've worked on 4 presidential campaigns. My guy lost 3 out of 4 times, so if I were a student, my HSC score would be really low. But I still feel qualified to talk about what these presidential campaigns are like. And in even the most congenial campaign, like the McCain campaign I worked in, John McCain. McCain had very clear views on foreign policy and economics. But even in the most congenial campaign, Republican or Democrat, these are coalition politics and they're different views. And so in the process of running for office, the transition, populating the new administration, there are always fights. In the Obama administration, there were big fights behind the scene between the Hillary Clinton people and the Obama people who had quite different views about alliances, China. In the Bush administration, famously, the sort of Cheney group and the sort of Powell group. Every administration has this. Every campaign has this. You're seeing that with Trump. So when the Heritage Foundation says, we're in charge, we're going to get rid of thousands of deep state bureaucrats and replace them with loyalists, or Don Jr. says we're going to purge the rhinos, Republican in name only. In some ways, that's very familiar. Now, it's more vindictive and angrier, and there's probably a higher demand from Trump of loyalty than in previous election campaigns. But that positioning is very familiar. And it gets a lot of attention from the press because it's a little bit scary, and it's great copy. But what you don't see in the press is what I would argue, far more consequential group that's not going out in public that will populate the key parts of any Trump administration. Sometimes, you'll hear catastrophizing people say heritage is going to take over. We won't get adults in the room. Trump 2 will be worse. I don't think that's true. I think, based on people I know personally and have talked to, that there are Republicans in the House and Senate, including staffers and members, people on Wall Street who would absolutely serve in a Trump administration, who are actually quite internationalist in the Ronald Reagan tradition. They are loyal to Trump. There are people who don't fight with Donald Trump because they know that that's not only bad for their future in any administration, but bad for their election district because Trump has such a hold on primary voters. But they're there and they're good. So if I were betting money, I would say the dynamic in a Trump administration would be you have more concentrated and prepared MAGA, anti-deep state, Heritage Foundation, America First Institute ideologues, and you have more better prepared traditional internationalists and Republicans. And I think in some ways that's like every presidential campaign and transition to power. If Trump wins, it's going to be more intense. It'll be more chaotic. But if you're an ally and you're doing your homework, which I'm quite sure Kevin Rudd and the embassy in Washington are doing, or the Japanese Ambassador Yamada in Washington, you know who those people are. You know who your allies are. You start working on issues, start thinking how you're going to get things done. You start thinking about what maybe you don't want to do if Trump wins. There's something to sort of put on the back burner. But it's not a cause for catastrophizing and just throwing your hands up, which, to be honest, some governments did last time to their enormous detriment.
Yeah. And it does seem Australia and Japan in particular fared quite well under the last Trump administration. So they did give a bit of a roadmap or a guide, a playbook for how you work with this administration. And even in the Biden administration, not everyone is singing from the same songbook. Not everyone is in total lockstep and agreement on everything. But how do you think a Biden administration would be either different from or similar to a Trump administration on Indo-Pacific issues?
So it used to be with George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, that the Republican Party, Republican campaigns, Republican administrations, especially with George Herbert Walker Bush, were the most disciplined and hid their fights. Tables have turned. Now it's the Democrats who are incredibly disciplined. They hide their fights. But there are actually quite significant divisions within the Biden administration over trade, over how much to, frankly, spend on defense. As you'd expect from a Democratic center-left government dealing with hard power, tough issues. If Biden gets reelected, which I think is your question basically, and we have a Biden 2, history's a little bit of a guide. When Democratic presidents have been reelected, Clinton and Obama in recent years, their second terms were characterized by a shift to the center on foreign policy and trade. NAFTA and negotiating with China to enter the WTO really happened after Bill Clinton got reelected. Obama only really embraced TPP and trade policy after he got reelected. Second-term Democratic administrations in the last 30 years have shifted in a more internationalist direction on trade. That trade politics are now different. They're much more complicated. It used to be easier to understand how you put a coalition together to pass free trade legislation in the Congress. It's more complicated now because the Republicans used to know who to go to, but now their older, whiter, less internationalist voters are opposed to trade. Democrats used to know who to go to, but they're younger, more cosmopolitan, more diverse voters are more pro-trade. So the interest group politics are all gunked up, and politicians are not quite sure how to do it. So it is more complicated, but I think U.S. allies, frankly, U.S. agricultural interests, business, um, ought to be putting some pressure on Biden when he's reelected to think more seriously than they have about economic statecraft. Going back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership isn't in the cards, but we have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the Biden administration introduced. It's got 4 chapters, the 4 pillars. The trade pillar is pretty anemic, pretty dead in the water.
Yeah.
So there's stuff that could be done. And on the defense side, Biden's been pretty good, actually. He's the first Democratic presidential candidate since Lyndon Baines Johnson, basically, to run on increasing defense spending, which he's done. But I think on the national security side, too, the pattern is a reelected Democratic administration, a little less beholden to traditional center-left interest groups, tends to get a little more hawkish, too. And God knows Russia, China, North Korea are making that necessary. So it's going to be more incremental, of course, but I think there's room for looking for some new developments in how a Biden administration moves forward. A lot will depend, and we have a whole chapter on this, who controls the House and Senate.
Yeah. Because
of the divided government. A lot depends on that, too.
Yeah, that's going to be a huge factor. Now, you mentioned the importance of, DFAT and the embassies and other allies and partners to kind of do their homework now, to do their prep work now, to, I guess, kind of game out how they would work with either administration, if it's a second administration. And fortunately, we have a 4-year track record for both candidates. So both of them are known quantities to some extent. But what would you recommend that homework looks like? How should they prep? Or if you were giving tips on, okay, this is the way, these are the things to look at, these are the areas to pursue, how would you recommend they go about that deep dive in preparation?
Well, of course, first and foremost, carefully read the U.S. Study Center's Red Book, Blue Book.
Yes.
And I was at CSIS for 15 years. I was at Council on Foreign Relations earlier in my career. U.S. think tanks don't produce products like Red Book, Blue Book. It's a long story why, but U.S. think tanks, if they're nonpartisan, will put out blueprints for what a new administration should do and make the case for the policy recommendations, but don't do sort of forecasting or analysis of what one or the other candidate will do in office. It's too difficult for think tanks in the U.S. to do because, frankly, and I was this way myself, the senior scholars are often working for one or the other campaign. So it's very hard to have a sort of product like we did. So it's unique. It's useful. I hope that our friends around the world and not our enemies make use of it. The other thing is don't catastrophize. A German politician, very senior politician, was quoted recently saying, if Trump wins, Europe will face 2 authoritarian rivals, Putin and Trump. I mean, come on, take a deep breath. The European governments, Canada under Trudeau to some extent, got caught up in the identity politics that really characterized the U.S. presidential race. Part of the reason the U.S. is polarized, there are many reasons, but part of the reason is the big national debates and elections aren't about the future of the New Deal or the Great Society, which are about things, how much government spending, how much tax cuts, and you can make deals, you can do politics, but identity politics is about abortion and same-sex marriage, and there's not tons of room for compromise. So they're very polarizing, and I think it's a big mistake for allies and partners to get caught up in the identity politics one way or the other. I've heard in Australia some, I won't say names, but otherwise thoughtful people say, well, if Trump wins, the Australian government will have to understand that our alliance is based on interests, not values. That's just wrong. I mean, Trump himself may not have values that most Australians agree with. Polls show most Americans don't actually agree with Trump's values. They're voting based largely on, well, they're not voting yet, so we need to say the polls are still very early. But the polling is better for Trump because of the economy. Incumbents almost everywhere in the world are on their back foot because of inflation. And as our polls and other polls show, Americans, and especially the U.S. Congress, believe our alliance with Australia is based on more than just interests. It's based on our shared democratic values. And even no matter who wins, the American people will be worried about our democracy, but they will all fundamentally believe we are a democracy.
Yep.
And so I don't think, so my second point is don't fixate on, if you're an ally, on the identity politics. And don't do something foolish like say, somehow our values are different from the U.S. because that's not what Americans will think. That's not what many people in a Trump administration, if not the president himself, if it's Trump, but many people in the Trump administration will believe that our alliance with Japan, with Australia, with Korea is based on our democratic values. So don't jump to conclusions on that would be the second thing. The third thing to prepare is, like I said earlier, U.S. politics, U.S. policymaking is a great big scrum. It's a great big, start meeting people, start generating ideas. Don't assume that a Trump administration will continue Biden's policies, of course, but don't assume Biden will. Start brainstorming. America has a very open and accessible political and policy process for trusted allies. Putin gets in it through disinformation, which is different. But for trusted allies, you can sit down in the room and talk to the national security advisors for candidates. You can talk to think tanks. You can talk to members of Congress and staff who may end up being undersecretaries of defense. You can get in and mix it up. And I think the Australian embassy, Japanese, British embassy are doing that pretty well. And then there's going to have to be some discipline. Governments are going to have to decide sort of what they push and what they don't. If Trump's president, the U.S.-Australia climate compact will have to be sort of carefully managed. Its content is really about stuff Republicans will agree with. Climate change, not climate change, but supply chains, critical minerals. So last point is don't get obsessed with the previous packaging. Think about how to repackage things you're doing with the U.S. to fit the political climate, but keep the core parts that are really useful.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned climate change, and we have the climate change section in the book. And yes, it's not quite the same as, critical minerals and supply chains, but even what, the author Lachlan Carey points out is that, the sentiment or the values might be different between Biden and Trump on climate change issues, but a lot of the pragmatic, flow-ons from it are the same, and often it does touch in the critical mineral space or on just even the economy and boosting the economy or the tech and innovation, things like that. Like there's things that where there are shared interests, but the way of achieving it might look different, but there are certain things that would be the same.
It's basic diplomacy or basic politics if you want to get something done, which is listen to the other side, hear their priorities, and figure out how you shape things so that your priorities and the new administration's priorities or the returning administration's priorities fit. But you got to listen to do that. You got to get out there and you got to hear people, and some of it will scare you if you're an embassy, but you got to get out there and figure out the landscape. Which, look, let's face it, the Australian embassy is second to none in having that kind of dialogue with the American body politic at a local and national level. And as I said, Japan and Britain are good. So Australia is well positioned if it wants to be.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to ask about, because I've heard you talk about it before, but in particular, how Japan fared under Prime Minister Abe Shinzo in his relationship with former President Trump, and that he really excelled on that leader to leader relational level. Could you talk us through a little bit about why you think that was so unique, or what he did particularly well that would be good for other governments to pay attention to?
So Abe was excellent. I remember having dinner with some British Foreign Office friends with my wife, and they were telling me that when Theresa May was prime minister, they tried to keep her away from Trump because it never went well. And I said, that's interesting, because the Japanese Gaimusho, the foreign ministry's strategy was to get Abe in front of Trump as much as possible. And I remember a friend congratulating the Japanese ambassador that Abe had at that point 18 summits with Trump, more than any other world leader.
Wow. And
the Japanese, it wasn't the ambassador, but the senior Japanese diplomat hesitating said, well, to be accurate, we've had the same summit 18 times. So Abe went back in with Donald Trump, and 18 times or more, playing golf or having dinner in Mar-a-Lago, when Donald Trump said, you guys rip us off, we have a trade deficit, we shouldn't defend you, Abe would say, yeah, I know what you're saying, but, for my part, I'm grateful that American boys and girls are willing to put themselves at risk to save our alliance and to serve freedom. And he would just sort of patiently manage it and maneuver Trump into the right place. That takes a real discipline it takes, to be honest, a certain willingness, I hate to say it, but to flatter Trump. And the politicians who could not do that, like Trudeau in Canada or Macron, their relationship didn't last. But, Abe was able to do it because he was a patriot. It was in his country's interests. And importantly, the vast majority of people working in the State Department, the Pentagon, and the White House who were appointed by Donald Trump agreed with Abe that it was in our interests and helped from the inside. It was easier for Abe, frankly. It was probably easier for Scott Morrison, definitely easier for Modi, because they were parties on the right. It takes a particular discipline for a party on the left to do what I just said.
Yeah.
And so let's face it, it'll be harder for Albanese and Wong and company than it was for Marles Dutton and Maurice Payne, just because of politics.
Yeah.
But they can do it. They can do it. And their base will give them a hard time if it's Trump. We know that. But they're patriots too. And they know what's in Australia's interests, and they know the U.S., and they know the high regard that Americans of all stripes, especially in Congress, hold Australia. They start from a very good place.
Yeah, very much. And so much of this is going to come down to these relationships, these dynamics, relationships between these leader to leader, embassy to all the people in Washington, and the relationship between the administration and Congress. All of these dynamics are going to very significantly impact how these policies play out. So that's a huge focus of what we talk about in the book. And if Mike didn't plug it enough, I'll give it one last plug. Please make sure to go to our website, ussc.edu.au, and you can download a copy of Red Book, Blue Book, A Guide to the Next U.S. Administration. So now I'd love to turn and get your by the numbers stat on this very important and broad topic. What have you selected for us today?
$9 billion and $14.7 billion.
Okay.
Do I explain what they are, or does everyone have to guess and write in?
Yeah, if you're on our YouTube channel, type in the comments what your guess is, and then Mike's going to explain.
So $9 billion is how much the Biden administration asked from the Congress to pay for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is additional money to help the Indo-Pacific Command work with Australia, Japan, Korea, and other allies in the Indo-Pacific region to maintain deterrence and stability. So the administration asked for $9 billion from Congress.
And that's U.S. billion, I'm assuming.
Yes, yeah. U.S. billion. Yeah. A lot of money.
Yeah.
$14.7 billion is how much money the Congress told the administration to spend.
Wow, okay.
And I used that number, and it's in Peter Dean's chapter on Congress, because it illustrates this structural factor I'm talking about, and the checks and balances, and the enormous support for U.S. allies in Asia, and the concern about China that's bipartisan in the U.S. Congress. They were told, we want $9 billion. They said, no, you want $14.7 billion. That's what we're giving you. And Biden is good on Asia. And the Biden administration has stepped up on Asia. They've appointed people like Kurt Campbell to really ramp up Asia strategy. But here you have an example of the Congress having taken the initiative and saying, no, do even more on Asia, do even more with allies. So that's an illustration of why we should pay very close attention to agency, to political leaders, interpreting what they said, being worried sometimes, but don't forget structure. Don't forget how much momentum and continuity there is behind U.S. engagement in Asia, despite some of the more distressing things we hear in the political discourse.
Well, that's a really encouraging story and a good example of those the structure that you talked about and the continuity that brings. So as we wrap up, I would just like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our audience. Mike Green, who you've just heard on the podcast today, he is the co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with Jude Blanchette, who's the Freeman Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our 2024 Election Watch kickoff. We're also going to be uploading recordings of the launch event we had in Parliament House in Canberra for Red Book, Blue Book, as well as a recording of the Sydney event as well. So you'll find those on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your podcasts. Mike, thanks again so much for making the time in this busy week. Great to chat.
Thanks, Mari.